Hello and welcome everybody. I'll just make a few introductory remarks as the participants start filing in, and then we can get started with the first panel. Welcome to the second day of STM Spring Conference. I'm Ian Moss and I'm the Chief Executive Officer of STM, and very happy to see you all, or not virtually see you all joining in today's session. We've got a really good lineup today and we've got a very good participation rate as well. So really welcome in particular those participants from outside of the publishing industry and outside of STM's membership, and those that may be attending their first STM conference, given the nature of the sessions. This day in particular, we wanted to have a very practical discussion of work on shared issues. And I particularly thank OCLC, the representatives of librarians, people who are working closely with STM members on the threat of cybercrime, and welcome you all to this discussion. Hopefully we can continue to work on this and on many other issues as well, given our interrelationships. Thanks to Joe from STM for all of the logistics and to all the contributors that have given up their time to prepare and perform. It does take a lot of time out of people's day and we greatly appreciated it. And thanks to today to our the people leading the panels, which would be Susie Winter for Springer Nature, Claudia from the STM team, and to Charlie from Kudos. So thanks to you for leading the panels today. The structure of the day is, firstly, we're going to talk about the Scholarly Networks Security Initiative, or SNSI, as they like to initialize. And the message we really want to get across is the importance of us all working together to combat cybercrime. It's a threat to the entire scholarly ecosystem, and regularly we hear of new attacks on educational establishments and the impact they have. Everything from disruption of services to patrons and financial costs, ransom demands, but certainly through the costs of repairing and securing networks following an attack. And this initiative is bringing organizations and individuals from across the ecosystem together to raise awareness of the collective threats and to highlight how we can work together to improve security for everyone. And this, in the session today, we'll hear from a security expert, a librarian, a technical solution provider, and a publisher. And as I say, we're all working together, we're all working collaboratively across those groups, and they'll share their experience and show the importance of that common endeavor. Then we'll have a session on what we call the article sharing framework, and we're very pleased to launch the framework today. This was designed to facilitate publishers and platforms to easily implement the new rules under Article 17 of the European Copyright Directive, for those of you who are in the weeds of that. The tool will be presented by some of the people who've been involved in the fundamentals of its construction, and together with other ongoing initiatives that we're involved in, it'll be another piece of the puzzle in both improving access to STM content by giving more certainty as to what it is possible to share. And this will fit in with a wider context of requiring more responsibility of all the players in the research ecosystem and in the online environment in general. And we'll launch the tool today, but it will need the contribution of as many publishing houses as possible. So don't hesitate to get in contact with STM or with Claudia, with the team after today if you need more support. And finally, we'll hear from Kudos. Charlie's the co-founder and chief customer officer. It was launched in 2013 to help researchers ensure publications get found, get read, and get cited in what we know is a world of information overload. And last month, Kudos published Brave New World, Scholarly Information After COVID, a study sponsored in part by STM and others that provide data and insights into how COVID-19 has affected scholarly communications, from emerging opportunities to recommendations for strategic and tactical responses. So this will be a fascinating overview of what people are saying and thinking, given the length of the pandemic and the challenges faced. And so Charlie will present the findings from the study, which ran between November and February, November 2020 to February 21, and had 2 global surveys and responses from over 10,000 researchers and over 600 librarians. So again, it's a really interesting cross-section of the scholarly community. So with all of that, thank you very much again for participating and coming, and I'll hand over to Susie Winter from Springer Nature for the first session. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much indeed, Ian, and apologies, I think there's a window that I'm just trying to get rid of. hopefully that's now, we'll solve that. So yes, hello everyone, and thank you all for joining us today for this discussion arranged by the Scholarly Networks Security Initiative on cybercrime, the threat this poses to scholarly communications and the wider scholarly ecosystem, and how, as Ian said, collectively we might be able to work to combat this. I'm Susie Winter, and the Director of Communications and Engagement at Springer Nature, and I've got the pleasure of moderating today's session. SNSI is a relatively new organisation, so if you haven't heard of us yet, you have now. And as Ian said in his introduction, was set up really to bring together publishers and institutions and other stakeholders as well to help solve cyber challenges threatening the integrity of the scientific record, scholarly systems, and the safety of personal data. Why? Because this threat has become increasingly clear and is something to which the sector is unfortunately particularly vulnerable. For example, the National Cybersecurity Centre in the UK places the education sector as the third largest target for attacks ahead of retail. This is due to the fact that most universities, including library systems, routinely store a tremendous amount of personal data. And earlier this month, the City of London Police's Intellectual Property Crime Unit, PIPCU, issued a statement specifically warning universities of a threat posed by a particular website. So according to PIPCU, Sci-Hub obtains academic papers through a variety of malicious means, such as the use of phishing emails to trick university staff and students into divulging their login credentials. Given this threat, they went so far as to advise IT departments to block the website on their network in order to mitigate the security risk. And a number of them, Manchester University and University College London amongst them, have issued such warnings. And also, as Ian said, when publishers and librarians, having successfully worked together before, for example, on Crossref, seamlessaccess.org, and most recently GetFTR, we really do think that such collaboration could reap benefits here too. So some of the questions we hope to start teasing out in today's session include: what support do librarians need from publishers and technology providers to effectively balance the need for access and the need for security and data protection? What role can IT security within institutions play in helping researchers avoid what could be risky convenience over legitimate options? And what support do institutions need to implement and uphold a secure network system that safeguards users and ensures streamlined, simple access? To help us start answering some of these, I'm delighted to welcome such an excellent and expert panel from across the librarian, information security, and publisher communities. We have Daniel Ayala, who's the managing partner for Socratic, a strategic information security and privacy consultancy focused on helping companies protect data and information and be prepared before incidents happen. Dan has also been a chief information security officer within higher education institutions. We have Don Hamparian, a senior product manager of platforms at OCLC, a global library cooperative that provides shared technology services, original research, and community programs for its membership and the library community at large. Sari Francis, Director of Content Protection Services at Elsevier, who develops and builds strategic visions to leverage new and existing technical solutions and establish work approaches to promote online terms of services and acceptable usage policies for Elsevier's online products. And we have Juan Denza, who is Engineering and Computer Science Librarian at Syracuse University Libraries. Juan also serves on the Library Discovery Team, and when at Binghamton University Libraries, worked on developing EZproxy scripts to combat breaches from Sci-Hub users. So how this will run, each panelist will speak for about 10 minutes about how they see from their perspective the challenge we're facing in protecting library and institutional networks, the damage that has been caused when protection measures haven't worked, and will share with us any solutions they've found. We'll then have an open discussion with plenty of time for questions and comments from the audience. So please do post these in the question box and I'll aim to get through as many as possible. And obviously, if your question is for a specific panel member, please do say so. So without further ado, I will pass over to Dan. If I can move that on. I will be doing the slides, so bear with us if the speakers need to give me a little prompt from time to time. But Dan, over to you.
Great. Thank you very much, Susie, and welcome everybody. So my name is Dan Ayala. In addition to being in higher ed, I've also spent time as a chief information security officer in this industry. So I tend to look at this from both of those perspectives. And it's a really, the goal of my time here today is to talk about how the CISO sees research and research protection from a securing and from a privacy perspective as a preamble to the solutions that the co-panelists will talk about. So if we move to the next slide, Susie, please. So information security, just as a primer, it consists of three things. We tend to think about information security very easily about confidentiality. How do we protect and make sure that only the right people can see things, that they aren't available to those that can't? But the realm of information security also includes two other items that are very important, and they become especially important as we talk about the research life cycle. That of integrity. How do we make sure that the information we have is genuine, that it is untampered and unfettered? And availability. How do we make sure that the systems that we use, that the information that we have is available when people need it to be able to facilitate the work they do, or to be able to recall information as it's needed? So these three things together bring on the information security remit. And also increasingly, we're seeing CISOs take on responsibility for the privacy realm, for data protection. And specifically within universities, there's a larger correlation between the act of, do we collect this data? How do we collect this data? What are we doing with this information, and how is it used and shared? That's falling within the Chief Information Security Officer's realm, either directly or as a partnership with a compliance or privacy organization. So I'm going to talk about all of those in the course of my time here. We can go to the next slide, please. So how does a CISO see research protection? If you think of this in a cycle, it starts with enabling the privacy of data subjects. As I mentioned before, how do we make sure that the things we collect are appropriate, that the research elements, working with IRBs, working with libraries, working with all of the different parts of the institution or organization in a business case, where to properly understand what data is being collected and advise on the risks. In many cases, the Information Security Office is one of the organizations that thinks about things in terms of risk. Financial parts of the organization often do. IRBs do, but information security is another place where we try to help and advise on the places where potential risks can exist and legalities, and so privacy definitely comes into the view of the CISO in this. Then there's the act of securing the research as it happens. We've seen an increase in, as Susie mentioned earlier, there's been over the last year especially, but we're not new to this. None of this is new, but it's definitely increased. We've seen an increase in the bad actors out in the world looking to get research as it's happening. In the era of COVID, universities have been specifically warned, by governmental organizations around the world about imminent attacks, where people are trying to get at the research as it's happening. They're not even waiting for it to be published or for results to be finalized. They're trying to take and get that data in order to either for competitive commercial purposes, for bringing that information into their own country if it's embargoed. Many of the same reasons we see research information being taken at all stages of the life cycle. But this has been a huge increase, and it's been something that we've had to deal with more and more over the past year, especially as it comes to research environments, which you don't have the same sets of controls that you do in, let's say, in a corporate organization, where you can say, these are the policies, these are the rules, and this is the parameters that we will all operate under. In the research world, there's often collaborations with other organizations, with other institutions. There's guidelines that come along with the grant funding that give them different parameters. And then there's also the independence that comes from researchers to be able to do the research they need to do. And so this poses some additional challenges in trying to secure this research as it happens. Then the CISO is also looking at making sure the integrity of the research data. And this is at all stages of the research process, from as the data is being created, is it being stored in a place that is that we have confidence in as research data is being generated through the course of the research? Is it being who's accessing it and who is updating it? Cases of research retraction continue to happen. Cases of data manipulation do continue to happen, either through the researchers themselves, but more commonly from outside entities that seek to influence the direction of the research. So we have to spend time focusing on how we protect that data from the moment it's created and through its entire life. Then we have to maintain the confidentiality of that research data. Who should have access to it? If it's early stage, if it's not ready for public consumption, how do we make sure that only the people that need to see it at that point have it? And as it grows, as we know, the audience for that research data continues to grow until ultimately many of those data sets become publicly available. So now it's taking it from a closed group all the way until an open group and trying to keep track of what stage of access and confidentiality all of that is. It requires a lot of orchestration and a lot of management. Excuse me. And then back to that triangle, the availability of research data. More and more, that type of data is being called upon beyond just the original research. So through the course of the actual research activity, that's fine. Now, when data sets become part of institutional repositories, when data sets become shared outside for additional researchers, there is an increasing expectation that those data sets, that the research behind it, that the methods behind it become available and are perpetually available. So how do we make sure that they're not just ready to be accessed today, but how can they be done over the long term as well by those that need them both in and outside of the institution? And then now we start to get into where SNSI and other similar initiatives around that STM have championed come into play around defending the appropriate use of resources. The Information Security Office is not a police officer, but what it is helping to put the controls in place so people use institutional resources appropriately. So people use, and this comes in both directions, those that are authorized to use it and those that are unauthorized to use it. We've seen cases in Sci-Hub and Sci-Hub style organizations where they're putting devices on networks to be able to use IP authentication to mine that, to be able to get content, to be able to use library resources, to be able to use university and network resources in a way that was not intended. The Information Security Office is looking at how to identify those and mitigate those continuously. And then supporting the reputation of research at the institution. More and more, the Information Security Office is realizing its place as part of the business of the university. Reputation of university plays as much into a university's ability or an institution's ability to continue to get research grants, to continue to get funding for their research. And so the information security world in that organization is continuing to increase. We've spent the last 6 months now focusing on ramifications from a group called SolarWinds. SolarWinds is a IT product that was taken over that had some code inserted in it and allowed for outside national actors to be able to get in. So now we're spending a lot of time looking at the heritage, at all of the third parties that organizations do business with, and making sure that our reputation doesn't get tied up in the third parties that we do business with, as well as making sure that the content and the information that we store on the network is and remains secure. You can go to the next slide, please. So just quickly, before we move on, some challenges to securing the research lifecycle. I think it is the world's worst kept secret that there are relationship challenges between IT and security, between IT and libraries and researchers and publishers and IT. You mesh any of these, and there have been longstanding challenges in those relationships. So many of them are historical. Many of them are starting to get better. But I think this is one of those areas where people in the security office have been really trying to build stronger relationships throughout the institution and with third-party partners. And so I think this is important to call out because I think it is one of the things that keeps measures like SNSI and Seamless and GetFTR from truly realizing all that they can, because, you know, there needs to be this collaboration across all of these. And I said, we're definitely working in those directions. But the more we do that, the better that these initiatives will, the more effective these initiatives will be. And I'm excited about that potential. The next challenge is around researcher and funder requirements for either technology or security versus institutional standards. The institution will set a baseline, but a research grant that's gotten may have different baselines, may leverage, you know, have a lot of cross-sharing of information across institutions, and your institution may not be the primary. So you defer to the, you know, the controls in place either from the funder or from another institution. Trying to keep all that straight, but still having it housed on your network adds risk, it adds complexity, and this is where things can get a little challenging. And this, you know, this incorporates the next bullet point too around collaboration. The fourth one I think is really, really important as we go into the rest of the discussion today, and that's the tug between security and privacy requirements and the ideologies around privacy. As you know, libraries are very much committed, and I think Don is going to talk about this in the next section about, you know, libraries and privacy. But the fact that some of this move toward further securing information pulls at the privacy ethos that the libraries come with and that universities come with means that we have to go even further to make those parts of the institution comfortable about the acts that are happening, to make sure that they know that there is not, you know, untoward activity. You know, I'm confident in that, but the more that we can help make those partners across the institution comfortable, the better, the more successful we'll be. Third-party risk management for research tools and technologies. I mentioned SolarWinds. This kind of research process now has to happen. This kind of research on the technologies and tools has to happen for every tool and technology that comes onto a campus. And that means extra time, extra effort, extra overhead, which adds friction to the relationship again. But it also means that IT teams are going to want to collapse the number of tools that are used, or try to make a limited set of tools they're confident in having researchers use. This again reduces the complexity of the environment and hopefully makes it easier to control. There's outside interest in accessing that and disrupting the research. I've talked about this already. I'll just leave it at that. Know that there are nation states that are very, and other entities that are very interested in getting at this research. And I use the analogy, water will always find its way. So if they really want it, they're going to find a way to get at it. The question is, how fast do you detect it, and how well do you respond to it? And those are going to be the key, you know, some of the key items that the CISO is focusing on. You know, how to mitigate. And then the last is, you know, the completeness and ease of use of these illicit tools. The one thing I hear regularly is that, you know, Sci-Hub is very easy to use. And it's got a complete corpus of research. It's hard to fight against that. And it's hard as a security organization to say, well, you can't, you know, don't use those. They're not secure. How do you paint that message versus the utility that that a researcher gets when trying to use those tools? So that's something, you know, the more informed we can make those researchers on the risks of using it, either from an integrity perspective, from a licensing and risk to the institution, a reputation perspective, those have been a huge help in getting that message across. And that's all the content I have. I think, Don, you're next. Yes?
Thank you. Sorry. Thanks, Dan. Sorry, we're just going, because of that annoying box that I think everyone is seeing on my screen, we're just going to do a very quick switch screen sharings before we move on to Don. So apologies to everyone so far, but hopefully this will mean that frustrating window will disappear. So I think Julia will be sharing her screen. Look at that, seamless. Thank you. So Don, thank you very much, Dan. Lots to think about and lots to have questions, I think, about towards the end. But Don, over to you.
Thanks, Dan. I really like that presentation. I like the challenges slide, and I'm going to drill in a bit on privacy and the library's role in this security ecosystem. Our two topics, go ahead and advance the slide there. There are two topics are how do we empower library staff to mitigate risk, and then how can EZproxy play as part of a librarian toolkit to support securing credentials, but even in a larger way, support protecting the privacy of patrons. So really what we're concentrating on is how do we empower libraries and their staff to mitigate these risks, which are real and significant. First off, you have to sort of have a message for the library when it comes to cybersecurity. And I think Dan's message was really resonating well there. And I think it's good to drill down a bit and point out to our librarian colleagues that the infrastructure of the library is typically protected by the same credentials that are used to access e-content. The information that's available on the site, including personal information about patrons, staff, and others, is also typically protected by the same credentials. And so the privacy angle there is very important. And then, of course, you have to have a secure infrastructure to have a high level of service for remote access to e-content, which is really my concentration here. And then stolen credentials, I think it's useful for the library colleagues to think about how many types of systems, data, infrastructure are affected by stolen credentials. Sometimes I think librarians will say, well, it's all about e-content, but it's really about these types of data infrastructures because, again, with single sign-on and use in many institutions, the access to various data systems is prevalent. And so from a librarian perspective, patron privacy comes in here, the privacy of staff is very important, and of course, access to e-content. So some of the ways to mitigate these risks have to do with good password policies. I certainly, in the days where I used to do a presentation like this live, I'd ask people to raise their hands. Do you have multi-factor authentication enabled at your institution? The answer hopefully is yes. That's a huge way to help with this. It's also very important to have password policies that are well known to your patrons and the value proposition. The previous slide described why it's important to secure access to systems. Password policy is certainly an important part of that. And that's the security education part. And then obviously you have to have a relationship with your IT and vendors, third-party vendors, to make sure that we're all aligned on our security strategy and our vision. And then for staff that are working remotely, which obviously is everyone pretty much these days, making sure that their own PCs, which are now in the network of the house or home office, that those are protected also. So OCLC, as a not-for-profit member cooperative of libraries, has a variety of commitments to this area of data protection and privacy. Obviously, because we're a cooperative, our processes and our own definitions of privacy are based around the library ethic of protecting privacy of patrons, protecting privacy of how they search, what they look for, when they search. And so that's a value that we inherit as part of being a cooperative. And then we need to take a multi-layer approach to this whole thing, to the whole aspect of security, privacy, and compliance. And as Dan was saying, there is going to be some tension here. And I think a little bit of tension is healthy, actually. It helps foster conversation and helps move us to a place where we can have both secured infrastructure and protect the privacy of our patrons. And obviously, in the last 5 years, privacy compliance is a huge issue. So what makes EZproxy a little bit different, and how can it help librarians as part of their toolbox, their tools for analyzing security and helping patrons protect privacy? Oops, I think you, oh, go ahead, sorry. Go ahead, Susie, or Julia, to the next slide. Thanks. First of all, EZproxy simplifies remote access. We maintain privacy, so IP proxying has a variety of aspects to it, but one of them is that it's sort of a privacy screen in a sense, and that it helps keep the patron data on one side and the access on the other side. It's important for IT system needs. It meets many of the requirements for IT. It's a pretty simple infrastructure to run. It's not particularly difficult to manage and maintain. And then, of course, it helps with analytics, because the output of the logs from EZproxy are very helpful for librarians to build statistics, analytics, usage reporting, student outcome type stats from. And we think that's a sort of a hidden benefit of what makes EZproxy different, that we don't talk about it as much as we should. For sort of a quick primer, how EZproxy works, you have a patron discovering items on their home network. They go and they discover and request an item, and then if EZproxy is enabled, it redirects to EZproxy. At that point, you authenticate. We have a session-based authentication scheme, so you authenticate once for e-content, and then whatever IDP is used, whatever authentication service is used, including Shibboleth and SAML, we authenticate against that. If you have multi-factor, that's where the multi-factor exercise occurs, is in step 3. And then we also do a look at our security rules to verify this user is actually entitled to log in. And so our security rules, which we added in release 7.1, provides real-time enforcement based on rules you define and you enable. And so you can define those rules to prevent logins if there's certain trips that occur. And then also, and I'll talk a little bit more about the identifier, you can send a pseudonymous identifier to the publisher, which helps them and the library in intrusion detection. Go ahead, Julia. Yes, and I should mention rich data. You get a lot of useful analytics data out of EZproxy. So in our recent release of 7.1, which occurred early this calendar year, we integrated a security rules infrastructure, which is a little bit different than some schemes that have been used in the past by various EZproxy administrators. It's actually embedded in EZproxy as a real-time component, and allows you to tune and watch your usage characteristics, so you can know and tune your rules. Something I didn't mention before was that one aspect of a librarian being a real security and privacy advocate is knowing your students. Where are they logging in from? What do they typically do? What are their workflows? And that helps also define these rules. In 7.2, which is coming out later this calendar year, we're going to add real-time alerting, which means we'll have a real-time and a digest method for sending alerts when rules are tripped or logged, and those will be defined by you. And that'll help because you don't have to be glued to a UI. You can be doing everything else you do during the day. And if you get a rule trip, you can go in and investigate it. The rules and the results of the rules are all based on UIs in the administration module. And the synonymous identifier we'll talk about in a minute, we think is a really helpful addition to EZproxy. And it does provide another tool in the toolkit to further detect compromised usage. So our synonymous identifier for publishers who sign up for that service, we send a synonymous identifier, which means it's encoded in such a way that you cannot detect the real identity of the user holding the identifier. We send that to the publisher, and that allows the publisher to group some of their intrusion data by user, but it's a user that is synonymous. And we, in order to continue to protect privacy, we actually modify and change the identifier every 30 days. And this identifier gives the publisher the ability, with the tools they already have, to have a little bit more information to identify compromised users, but they have to come back to the institution, which in our admin screens has the way to map the synonymous identifier to a real username, and then the institution can determine what to do with the compromised user. The whole goal here is to prevent complete turnoffs of the EZproxy server. And the experience with the publishers that are using this has been pretty positive. It is an opt-in feature for EZproxy, so I encourage all all you EZproxy administrators to seriously consider turning it on, because it's a valuable tool. And so various users, including Lawrence from Bath, have been using 7.1 for some time. He was one of our pilot users. And it gives them just so much more information about how to look for, how to detect compromised usage. It helps really significantly reduce the old methods of crunching through log files. So we're really excited about that. And then in our EZproxy, we offer it as a hosted service, and we certainly want to partner with our institutions to implement, and we have additional security updates that we provide as part of our hosted service. And so we're very confident that we can build a secure and a collaborative infrastructure for our library colleagues. And with that, I say thank you, and we'll move right along, and we'll be happy to engage with questions at the end of the presentation.
Thank you, Don, very much. Next up, we have Sari, and I want to know why you love clouds.
Well, happy you asked that question. So I'll kick it off, and I'll talk about why I do. So our presentation today will focus not only on clouds, but on Elsevier's involvement with SNSI and how we're looking for ways to address security with improved methods of accessing our content. And so we're grateful for STM to give us the opportunity to share our experience and talking about it with a story of why I love clouds. Next slide. So now every great story, nope, back one. One more. There you go. You can keep it on there. Thanks, Julia. Every great story, you'll be the judge in a couple of minutes, has characters, conflict, and resolution. And so I'll tell you a story about working together to solve problems larger than all of us can solve on their own. And I think we've already heard from Don and Dan about that too. So next slide. So who are the characters in our story? Well, since most of us here today are publishers, let's start with us. And if we're going to start with us, we should really start with our journals. And if we're going to start with journals, let's start with the very first journal, which is the Royal Society's Philosophical Transactions, which started 355 years ago. And a lot has changed since then, but a lot is not. We're a competitive group, and that has created an incredible orderly industry. Next is librarians, and this image is from UCSF when the library was a combination library laboratory because it was where learning occurred. I have a lot of friends that still think library as being a stack of books. And although an interesting stat I heard the other day was from one study that millennials use their academic library 73% less than the internet. I'm sure that doesn't surprise any of us, but have we considered the security implications of this shift? I'll come back to that. Researchers are also part of the story, and this drawing is from the National Science Teaching Association's recent Draw a Scientist project. And finally, there's me and my colleagues. Note we are labeled IT security and not content protection, which kind of reminds me I need a new title. IP and content in general has been our focus, but the problems today are far bigger than simply protecting PDFs. And characters in this story are not only concerned about stealing of intellectual property, but the protection of the systems they use. And many of us have been talking about network security for years. Next slide. And now others are beginning to understand the problem is not just content protection, but system protection, network protection, IP protection. It is a big and not orderly problem. And after seeing this press release, the University of Manchester also took action to protect their network by shutting off access to Sci-Hub. And over the past 3 years, we've aligned with universities to alert them of this threat and others and support their efforts to mitigate the problem. Next slide, please. So Karl Popper, who's a great philosopher of science, once divided the world into two categories, clocks and clouds. Clocks are neat, they are orderly systems with problems that can be solved. Clouds are messy, they're highly irregular, disorderly, and more or less unpredictable. Their problems are more complex to solve. The mistake of modern science, he said, is to pretend that everything is a clock. And I agree with Sir Popper when it comes to IT security. We live in a world of clouds and it's a highly disorderly mess. There are a lot of bad actors trying to do bad things to our systems, and it impacts all of us. Next slide, please. There are several key problems we face daily pertaining to digital piracy. There is the complexity of networks for both publishers and librarians. There's misconceptions on threats, privacy, security, the timeliness of adoption rate of tools. There's also broken or lack of trust and transparency with partners, but also finding a shared common space to discuss these problems, regardless of which character you are. There isn't a simple solution to these complex problems for all the characters in our story. But as Coco Chanel said, simplicity is the keynote of all true elegance. And SNSI was formed to identify elegantly simple solutions to these problems, and more importantly, facilitate the other conversations needed in our cloudy world. Next slide. So Elsevier joined to help both ourselves and others. We know we can't do this alone. And part of SNSI is made up of a technical working group and a university relations working group. And the technical working group does things like we scope out the problem, we're presenting an opportunity to share threat intelligence as well as other resources and tools. There's also the technical working group focuses on discussing alternative ways for customers to securely access publisher platforms. The University Relations Working Group, our main focus is on education and clarification on misconceptions of problems. And we do this by connecting and partnering with organizations such as OCLC, EDUCAUSE, JISC, and others. And by doing so, we're expanding our outreach to IT security as well through those mechanisms. We're also trying to be extremely transparent with partners and working collaboratively to establish trust. Next slide. So Carl has this quote also, that says, "Those who promise us paradise on earth never produced anything but a hell." And I agree with Carl. This is really not an easy task. Ours is a world of clouds, and we need conversation to help bring order to the chaos. Next slide, please. So if you're interested in learning more about SNSI and joining in our efforts, you can contact me or check out our website. And thank you again for your time. That's all I have.
Mary, thank you very much indeed. Your the title of your presentation has become beautifully clear to me.
It's not cloudy.
On a cloudy day. It is beautifully clear. Thank you very much. And finally, we have Juan who will talk about the work he did around his EZproxy fix. I first heard Juan speak actually in Charleston a couple of years ago, so I'm delighted that he's able to join us today and share his learnings. So Juan, over to you.
Thank you, Susie. So yes, so I'm going to talk about a case study of securing EZproxy, and I thank you, Dan and Don, for their previous talk, especially Don talking about new features implemented in EZproxy. And what I'm going to kind of discuss, as Susie mentioned years ago, a solution, kind of a technique that was done that I implemented at a university to help combat this before all these exciting new tools that are now introduced into EZproxy that make the process of securing EZproxy much easier for the administrator. So next slide, please. So a little background with working. So I worked at Binghamton University Library IT, and the IT staff there was comprised of an interim director, a system administrator, and a help desk specialist, which is what I served as. And then in 2016 and 2017, people had left and we were kind of short-staffed, so it ended up being just the library director and the system administrator, which I moved into that role. And the reason why I kind of bring this up is because oftentimes the staff that's managing EZproxy or managing electronic resources on the electronic side can be a much larger staff. Like for instance, at Syracuse University, we have an entire IT staff dedicated to securing all that stuff. But there are institutions where it could be possibly not even IT staff, it could be just a librarian or a staff member. So a little background on that. Next slide, please. So again, talking about how I worked as the system administrator, also the difficulty in all of this is that a lot of work is, of course, a lot of duties are placed upon administrators. And at the time, the primary duties I had was managing 14 servers. I was a project manager for a lot of new systems. And on top of all that, I had to manage all the library servers, including EZproxy. So the difficulty in that, you know, with all the primary duties and having to combat these kind of security leaks made it a really difficult challenge. And like I mentioned before, some libraries might be understaffed when it comes to IT support, and it could be just a librarian managing all of that. Next slide. So one of the ways that I developed this kind of system, and this is before, this was years ago before, as Don mentioned, a lot of what is implemented now in EZproxy. It's a lot of what we were doing in the past to help combat these security breaches, and a kind of system that I kind of created that I'm delighted to hear Dawn talk about, that especially with these kind of unique identifiers that are placed into EZproxy, make it a lot easier. So this kind of workaround, although can still be used and build upon, it's not as much as needed as much now with all the exciting tools from the new EZproxy updates. So the way I kind of implemented this was you start off with the kind of a circle around of the workflow of the data breaches to where you start off with the subject librarian reporting by a student that moves on to an eSource librarian that has to report this to a system administrator. And then from there, the system administrator contacts the vendor to say that there has been a leak and that we've ensured that the security breach has been filled. Please reinstate access. Because one of the things that often happens with publishers, as many librarians and libraries know, is if there are enough security breaches, the publisher will suspend access to content, which is it's a very problematic, because obviously libraries and institutions need that information and they pay for it, and every hour or every day that access is turned off is wasted money. So it's important to have kind of like to streamline this workflow so that when it is reported, you can turn access on. Next slide, please. So when I worked at Binghamton University in 2016, I was contacted by Sari. At the time, she was working for IEEE, and she had mentioned that we were having a lot of security breaches, which was causing IEEE to suspend our access. And we needed somehow or some way to kind of combat that. And that's where I developed this kind of script here to go ahead and find the security leaks and then kind of like fill the holes. And so the way it was designed was, again, there was a unique identifier that Don had mentioned that now is included in EZproxy, but at the time IEEE was embedding that into their system so that they could notify us to say that this unique breach had occurred. The problem with that is every time we were contacted by IEEE, it required us, again, to go through all of the logs manually to find which user account was compromised, have us secure that account, and then contact IEEE to have them reinstate our access. And that was very time consuming, as I mentioned before, working in IT, having to manage all of these systems. That's a lot of work having to go through all of these logs. So what I did was I developed a kind of script that automated it so it could pull in, it could extract those unique identifiers when the breach occurred, and then be able to go ahead and contact the user, suspend their account, have them change their password. Once we realize, or once we have it changed and secured, then we would contact IEEE and say, you know, here's proof that we've secured it. They would verify it, and then they would turn our access on. And if you look by this slide, you can see the difference, the number of breaches, which starts off in 10/2016. And you'll notice the bump here. There's kind of a small spike there, but you'll notice towards the end, we went from the number of breaches, next slide, to essentially almost zero. I'm sorry, can you move to the next slide? So again, the initial steps to contact, as I mentioned before, we had looked through logs rather, we blocked users, send IT requests. So the point here I'm trying to make here is we still need to be proactive. And if you just go to the next slide. And this just talks about, again, the script that I developed in kind of more detail. Next slide. And this is just a quick report, as I mentioned before. You'll notice here that we have the number of breaches here, which talks about the number of PDF downloads, which is how we kind of interpret it with IEEE as our breaches. And you'll notice here that it ends up in zero when I implemented the script. Next slide, please. And I just want to finish up by saying, you know, as Don mentioned earlier, all of these techniques that are now being implemented into EZproxy, it's still a difficult, it's still kind of a difficult thing to keep managing combatant. As I mentioned before, these scripts were implemented years ago before EZproxy had their enhancements into their new updates, but it's still kind of an issue, and that's what I continue to kind of work as a librarian and seeing the kind of difficulty. And then, yeah, and so that's it. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Juan. If I could quickly actually ask Julia, just so we don't keep flipping back to screens, could we just flip onto the next slide? Just if I just do that one next. So this is just, if I could just draw people's attention to this. If, as Sarah said, if you do want to find out more about SNSI, please do visit the website at snsi.info. And a bit of a shameless plug for a forthcoming SNSI sponsored webinar. Just got to do that, called Gone Phishing, Service Continuity After a Cyber Attack. Is your library prepared for a cyber attack? That we're sponsoring. There's some information there. And again, that information can be found on the SNSI website as well. So we are now in the roundtable discussion. And maybe if I just invite the panelists to come off, yes, to show your faces. And maybe Julia, I think we can probably stop screen sharing now so everyone can be more than a postage stamp size, if that works. So please do, everyone, keep putting your questions into the question box that you have for any of the panelists. Actually, haven't done my own thing. I'll take myself off video as well. Wow, I mean, an awful lot that we've got through there. I'm going to abuse my position as host, as moderator, and ask a first question. And it picks up because actually, so I mentioned the City of London Police and the PIPQ statement, and Dan, you mentioned it as well, and Sarah, you did too. General, just opening question then, really, when the police forces such as PIPQ are so clear in statements like that, why is it that you think that that people still really don't view sites such as Sci-Hub as a problem, when you've got very, very clear messages coming from law enforcement about the threat and the damage it could do? Dan, can we start maybe with you on that?
Yeah, I mean, for me, just from all the discussions I've had, and this goes beyond just Sci-Hub, friction loses the day. If you've got friction in a process, Sci-Hub is easy. It's fast, it's easy, it's available. It gets you 90% of the way there in the mind of the person that's looking at it. And so it is hard to get that message across until you start to talk about the integrity discussion. And then that's when it starts to click on that the information there either needs to be re-verified, or it may be better to just go to an authoritative source from the start. But people are trying to get lots of information very quickly, and they want an easy way to do it. And the comprehensiveness, I can't underplay the amount of impact that having to go to multiple different places to get all your scope of content has on people as they're doing research.
Thanks, Sarah. Would you agree with that? Because I think that's a bit of a challenge back to publishers, isn't it?
Yes, and I mean, Dan hit the nail on the head. It's that Sci-Hub is easy, and some of these other, even not just Sci-Hub, but some of these other sites it's easier for them to access. But I think that's why we have some of these other collaborative organizations like Seamless Access, Get FTR, to address some of those issues, because I think that's what we all kind of want, is to have everybody access content in a secure way. And I think that also, with digital piracy in general, I think people it's becoming more the norm, and which is kind of scary. But at the same time, I think it's important that people, take some, have some proactive measures that they take. And that's another great reason why SNSI is a good thing that we've done, because I think that, you know, sharing those ideas and those tools too, and mix it up is definitely going to help mitigate.
One, do you hear a similar view from your, librarian colleagues about that sort of that tension and that friction between, ease of access and illegality, and the legality or otherwise of such sites and the threats they might pose?
Yes, it's always a discussion as far as definitely easy access. And that's one of the things that librarians tend to worry about, is kind of that ease of access that kind of pride themselves on.
And so Dom, from a sort of technology perspective, a lot of what you're looking to do is to facilitate that ease, at least in terms of authentication, right?
Yes, I would add that we're in the middle of a pandemic, and so people's ability to absorb yet another, oh my gosh, go do this sort of action is a little bit tough right now. I do also think that the education about securing the credentials, protecting privacy, has to be holistic. And when you enter into a conversation and say we have to protect this particular publisher, it doesn't resonate quite as well as saying, are we protecting the patrons that librarians are advocating for? So it's really good to have that holistic conversation. And on the authentication and detection side, yes, we have to move, and we are moving from more manual analysis of issues to try to detect compromised credentials and other activity. And so that's imperative, because time in the middle of a pandemic is scarce. Librarians are focused entirely on providing access, and the only access is remote. So that's the prime directive at this point. And then in the authentication world, I think the work that happened through NISO and RA21 and Seamless helps with the what we call institution discovery workflow in identity management, which is making it easier to find how you authenticate as a user when you go to a publisher site. And I think that's going to be really helpful also.
Wonderful. Thanks, everyone. So switching some of the questions or comments that we've had coming in, to start with one that says, love the clouds and concept of collaboration. As Dan mentioned, there are long-standing relationship challenges, and they are quite hardened in many areas. And that was a particular point, actually, Dan, that I noted from your presentation as well. But this person in particular is interested in what Sarah is hearing in conversations with her characters regarding SNSI and the possibility of working better together.
That's a really great question, Susie. And it's the conversations that we've had is that, well, people are positive. The people that we've talked to want to help, and they understand what the ramifications are of, not having something in place and ensuring the safety and protection of whether it's their patrons, their content, whatever. And, with things like what's happening with PIPQ and the National Cybersecurity Center, like, they are taking these things very seriously. And so we find in their conversations that is also a theme. And so, but what the challenges are that there's, like, as I mentioned, there's not one perfect solution. There's no one silver bullet that's really going to do that, because all the complexity of everybody's networks and systems, and even amongst publishers, we've seen that, we've had that discussion within SNSI, say, okay, well, how do we really, find the perfect fit? So, but overall, that's kind of the scope of the conversations that we've had. But it's been very positive and really great to hear that people are taking action.
Just passing that actually on to maybe Dan and to one particularly as well from the CISO and the librarian communities. Is there anything more? What more should publishers, for example, could we do to help you in building those relationships as well, you know, across the institution, not necessarily just coming in from the outside. Is there anything we can and should be doing?
Juan, do you want to start?
Yeah.
This is like the $1 million question.
I know, right?
Didn't say they were going to be easy questions.
On the publisher side, you know, I think one of the things that makes it challenging for librarians and institutions is, you know, the challenge is bridging that kind of gap, and that kind of honestly, oftentimes there's kind of this struggle with publishers and librarians, kind of this general clashing over getting together on this. So I think in order for publishers to help is to be kind of open to these kind of conversations. One of the things that librarians often and institutions often worry is they're being left out of conversations. So I think what's really important for publishers to really help with that is to be open to these conversations. And that's kind of like the purpose of this group, is to kind of help with that. And that's why I'm proud to be serving as a librarian and voice, and be able to have a voice here to help this group and publishers as a whole. So I think definitely that helps a tremendous help.
Mm-hmm. I would agree that Juan's point is very important. Librarians sometimes are hesitant to step up into conversations that are maybe outside of their core space. And to solve this type of security ecosystem problem requires everyone. I think of the example, you know, usernames can be stolen with phishing emails. Well, librarians don't control email servers. They don't control firewalls to control email servers. And so you have to reach out. And on the IT side, I think IT has to be careful about just assuming they know everything and they're just going to go and here's the solution, get with the program sort of attitude that also can be cause friction in conversations and collaboration. So it's a sort of a two-way street, because this problem is bigger than any one organization at the institution. And so it does require that type of collaboration.
Yeah, and I'll add on to that and say, you know, the same challenge exists between the Information Security Office and the library, and the Information Security Office and the rest of the institution or organization as a whole. And the best way I've found through that is both, you know, taking a servant leadership position and saying how, you know, we're here to help you. We're here to help the library, not in that we're here from corporate, we're here to help mindset, but you know, really, what can we do to facilitate the business of the library, and what can we do to facilitate the business of the university and the business of the research, and that taking that same approach as we build those relationships between security and the rest of the institution. The same thing can happen between publishers and the institutions, publishers and security. I think those are a little stronger relationship when we have to get in touch with the university's security organization. But I think there's an opportunity for some trilateral work there to really just build relationships and get to know each other at a way that's beyond, hey, we just locked off all your access and now you need to go do something in order to restore your university. And then similarly, you know, that there is a middle ground between perfect privacy and the myth of perfect privacy and a fully open world, and trying to find that so that we can facilitate systems that give people the access that they need in a way that still it is both transparent and lets the libraries be comfortable that we're doing the right things with information.
Great, thanks everyone. I've got a specific question for Don. The new security protocols for EZproxy look terrific. What was the timing of these new changes? And given that they are relatively new, what are the plans for testing, revision? Very specific one for you there, Don.
Sure. The release that contains the security rules subsystem came out in January of this year. And we've set it up in such a way that the administrators can tune those rules, and they can elect to turn off enforcement if they want to do some logging first. And it's probably wise to consider doing logging with the current rule set for maybe a month, see what what comes up on the rule screens, and then start turning on enforcement based on that. So we designed it hopefully to give library administrators a lot of opportunities to learn about their patrons' usage through these rules and the screens that show the usage, and then to start turning on enforcement. We had a pretty long pilot period before that, and we had a number of pilots from small to large institutions involved in that. And so we feel pretty good about the technology. It just requires the administrator to really start gathering and understanding how they need to tune the rules.
And Don, you had obviously, you know, a testimonial feedback there from University of Bath. I mean, is there any other feedback that you're able to sort of share, you know, that goes beyond actual people actually using it, sort of beyond, yes, it works technically, but from a more user perspective?
Yeah. You know, it's funny because so many times we think that technology solves all these problems. And what really needs to happen here—
Dan's shaking his head.
We really, in this particular arena with the security rules very specifically, you have to be monitoring them, you know, checking in on them, and tweaking and tuning, because what we have learned is each institution's workflows are a bit different. So you can't apply a blanket set of enforcement rules over all the institutions that run EZproxy. So it does still take some investment on the administrator's part to do some tuning. We have a number of webinars and office hours and so on that we have during the month. So if you're interested in learning more, feel free to go to our website, and you'll see that list, and feel free to sign up and get involved, or just email me if you have a question.
Great, thanks, Dom. So moving on, further question, I suppose this is probably for Dan and Juan, I would think. Are students and faculty required to adhere to written security protocols? In short, are there policies in place? And if yes, are there consequences for non-compliance? I suppose, do students have to sign that they're not going to share their login credentials? And what happens if they do, I suppose, is the label.
Are there policies? Yes. Are they required to adhere to them? Yes. There's at a more ethereal level, but at a practical level, we know the realities of life, and you combine that with things like academic freedom and research integrity. All of these things culminate, especially in universities, into a world that it's not quite as crystal clear as you shared your credentials and you're gone. But we definitely have seen a move toward progressive enforcement from a technology perspective. The use of multi-factor authentication as a deterrent from sharing usernames and credentials to make it a little more difficult. But again, we come back to adding friction. So we have to find the right balance between carrot and stick. Yes, at the end of the day, if it's abusive, if it's continuous, you will see some action taken, and it usually then will end up in the as a provost action if it's students, or administrative action if it's faculty and staff. But it takes a long time to get there.
Don, I've seen you come off mute, because is this something that really, with the new rollout, that maybe the synonymous identifiers being able to actually more identify synonymously, the people might actually have a role to play there as well?
We think the identifier is a great way to augment your detection toolbox, because it provides privacy. At the same time, it helps leverage some of the investment that publishers have made in intrusion detection technology. We think it's really a good blend there. And because it results in a communication workflow back to the institution, since the publisher doesn't know who the user actually is, that helps the institution practice their own user credential management, and those tend to differ over institutions. And I would comment too on the question, Susie, that today's students grow up in a world of cell phones, social media, everything shared, everything needs to be told to my friends, and it's a different environment. And that also is an education issue because you have to start with that context as you educate.
Yep. Juan, was there anything you wanted to add on that?
What I wanted to add is, you know, as Dan mentioned, you know, there are policies in place, but the difficulty is kind of in policing that, which is challenging too, because a lot of students and faculty don't realize that the compromise is generally a real issue, right? Or a big issue. For instance, if, say, your private information from your email or, say, your Instagram, Facebook account, things like that from social media, they're more concerned because that has more private information. But if your credentials are being taken and being abused to access content, a lot of students feel like, you know, it's kind of like not my problem kind of thing. So the difficulty in that for institutions is kind of like even policing that, because on the one hand, you don't want to completely turn access off to the researcher because that impacts their research, and especially as a student, as they're going along, you know, they have deadlines to make. It's difficult for them, and they will push back. And that's another challenge for the administration is if you have too many, you know, you're closing too many accounts or suspending too many accounts, that creates a problem, and students and faculty will push back. So I would say also that it's important to, I guess, yeah, I'm trying to think here. Yeah, I guess that's all I have to say about that.
I suppose that, yeah, and I suppose that slide, I think, Don, it was in your presentation about the other, you know, the other ways these login credentials to content are actually applicable to other bits of data, of where data is held at the institution as well. So one, you're saying, you know, they think it's because it's not necessarily their content, it's actually not so much of an issue for them, not realizing that actually the login credentials are applicable across other areas of the institution as well.
And that came up early in the RA21 work. Oh, go ahead.
I'm sorry. And one of the challenges also is to kind of make the point that it is like the institution's responsibility as well as the publisher, you know, and that's the thing that kind of institutions kind of struggle with, because they're like, well, you're the publisher, it's your content, you should be securing it. And then the publisher might come and say, well, you're the library, you're the end user, you need to secure that. So there has to be kind of this area where we both kind of meet in the middle. And I'm sorry, Dan, go ahead.
I was just going to say that tie of user accounts to make it less faceless, you know, the faceless crime, so to speak, of content. Now that it's being tied back, we identified this early in the RA21, now seamless work, was that giving that common credential, while it improves, it now means if you're giving this up, you're also giving up your access to your grades, to other things that are, you know, very critical, or HR information that are critical to you. So you're less inclined to do so. And it helps to bolster overall security. The other is a focus on research integrity. That, you know, giving credentials out or sharing that kind of information has a potential impact on somebody being able to update your research data. Now this affects your reputation, ability to get future grants and funding, or if you're a student, that somebody could submit information as you to a professor, potential have academic misconduct issues. So that, you know, something that ties to ramifications has been a good positive move. Why the, you know, and the beneficiary is that they're going to use, you know, that they're not going to be sharing those credentials.
Great, thank you all. So next question. So please do, as I said, please do keep your questions coming in to the question box. Next question is, with the transition to open access content, won't many of these security issues become moot?
I think I could speak for the panelists when I say the answer is no. Because attacking assets at the institution, whether it's your patron data, whether it's information about you, whether it's research data, will continue because there's a lot of interests here that want to have access to that data. So certainly open access, that's a whole different conversation about what that does, but it does not solve the security issue because the institution and its data and its people have a lot of value to people who want to do harm.
What Don said.
Excellent. Thanks. Sarah, anything to add, or what Don said as well?
No, I mean, I think Don covered it, but we're still seeing security. We're still seeing some intrusions and things like that on open access, and bad actors want to do bad things, regardless if it's open access or not. And so, and I've gotten that question like every time. So, but Don answered it for me. So. Thanks, Don.
Thanks. So another question, what would you say are the key points of a risk-benefit analysis for publishers considering alternative off-campus access solutions in this atypical time? I'm assuming they're obviously referring to pandemic, especially with those customers, i.e. corporates, who don't fit into the emerging industry solutions like seamless access. We see some publishers lowering their paywalls as a stopgap measure, but that isn't very sustainable. What are your thoughts?
As I understand it, Seamless is not actually bounded by particular industry. It's more of a technology compatibility. So there's nothing that and I'm not part of the project anymore, but I know that there's nothing that technologically says it couldn't be expanded beyond. But I think there's and corporate entities are looking to move toward the same kind of common shared authentication with robust authentication as universities, and they're actually further ahead of the curve and more willing to adopt. So it's actually not a bad time to try to engage in those measures. Of course, lowering the paywall is as you mentioned, is not a sustainable item, but I think it certainly is worth looking at whether or not that something like that shared authentication as a single sign-on authentication could be expanded to include those environments as well. And again, the corporates, having come from corporate as well, that was a very strong push. In fact, you'll get really good uptake from companies if you want to include them in those that type of technology shared single sign-on.
Thanks, Dan. I think we've got time for one more question. And actually, I think we've come to the end of the questions in the Q&A box. So my final thing, before I obviously say thank you hugely to our wonderful, wonderful panelists, what would be the one thing that you would urge your community to do to help, that you think your community could do to help? So obviously forget about everyone else, but Sarah, what's the one thing that publishers should be doing? What's the one thing librarians, Dan, obviously, and Don, IT and software solutions. Who would like to go first? Dan's volunteering.
I'll start. In the words of Vanilla Ice, stop, collaborate, and listen. This is really for the security world. This is a time to sit and listen and understand the business, how the people around us do what they do and what we can do to help that. We talk in the information security industry about moving from the office of know, N-O, to the office of know, K-N-O-W. And this is a place where people in this chair can stop and listen and understand and help facilitate rather than be blockers. And I think that will go miles toward easing some of those intra organization challenges, and help to create solutions together that that facilitate people getting access to content in a meaningful way, and doing so in a way that is easy for them to do from on campus and off, and using the official methods rather than encouraging them to go the other route because it's difficult, because it's complex, because it's friction.
Wonderful. And I think you've given me the title of my next blog. Don.
I think what Dan said is really good. It is about relationships. It's always important to know that the technology is important, but the relationships are what are key in moving forward in this particular area. And I think specifically in the library space, our librarians having a holistic view of privacy and security and protecting research and patron data. That helps a lot when you have that holistic view. And then I would ask that the libraries feel they should feel empowered to speak boldly in their campus organizations outside of the library on that topic.
What's the one thing that the librarians could do?
Well, I agree. I think Dan said it best, but I just want to emphasize the thing that librarians, the one thing that they can do is get involved. Like I mentioned before, I'm part of this group. I was fortunate to be approached by this group and invited to join. And I would say, get involved. Don't just talk about it or, and say, this is a problem or this is not our problem or publishers are not doing enough. You need to get involved. And one of the things that I would say for publishers, and I just want to mention, which I think is very important, and I'm also delighted to present at this conference and knowing that it's open to everyone. Typically this conference is for publishers, but it's open to librarians. I promoted it and say, librarians. So for publishers, the more conferences like this to where librarians can participate, especially when they're free, is another great thing. One thing to do is to invite us, have us in these conversations, have these conferences and say, please join us. So that would be.
Wonderful. Thank you. Sari.
I think, everybody already covered the key takeaways here is for all the characters in our story. But with publishers, it's definitely get involved. And I know sometimes, with these groups, it takes a lot of effort and time, and it's not really part of our day job, but it's very, very important. And so, just to take into consideration that we're helping not just ourselves, but the entire ecosystem. And that's what's going to help us continue to grow and move all together, and building those relationships. But also I think share really is a key item for us. So sharing threat intelligence, sharing, our experiences, that is, I think, the most important thing that other publishers can do to help in this regard.
Wonderful. I'm just going to do a final check. All good. So I think we have 2 minutes to spare. Thank you all so much. That has been an absolutely fascinating discussion, and just fantastic to hear from all the different stakeholders, because I think, as Juan has said, and Sari as well, and everyone, we can only really solve this together. There's no one stakeholder in this in this world that is going to be able to solve this. So thank you all very, very much for sparing the time. To the audience, thank you very much for your questions, for being so engaged. For that was brilliant. Do check out the SNSI website for upcoming events and conferences and seminars that we'll be running to really try and get that collaboration and that partnership and that talking together more underway. So thank you all very, very much. I believe the STM conference is now going to a coffee break or tea break, whatever beverage of choice is yours. And we'll see you back in half an hour's time. So that's 4 p.m. British Summer Time, 11 a.m. Eastern, I believe. So thank you all very much indeed.